The late afternoon sun bathed the garden in warm light as relatives mingled, the smell of barbecue smoke mixing with the scent of blooming flowers. Laughter rose above the chatter as children darted between tables, playing tag. For 20 years, the family reunion had been a cornerstone of tradition. Andrew stood near the drinks table, swirling a glass of iced tea. He watched his wife, Helen, with an unreadable expression as she glided between guests, her laughter ringing out louder than usual. Tyler, Jacob, and Arya moved among their cousins, seemingly carefree. Luke stood at the heart of it all, gesturing animatedly while recounting one of his infamous stories. People hung on every word, bursting into applause at the punchline. Andrew managed a polite laugh as he approached the group, noting how Luke's arm casually brushed Helen's shoulder. She leaned in, whispering something that made Luke chuckle. The brief exchange sent an uncomfortable knot twisting in Andrew's stomach, but he quickly pushed it aside. "Andrew," called Margaret, an elderly aunt sitting near the edge of the circle. "You've done a wonderful job hosting again. Such a beautiful gathering." "Thanks, Aunt Margaret." Andrew flashed a smile, but his gaze drifted back to Helen. She caught his eye and gave a wave that felt more obligatory than warm. He tried to focus on the guests. A distant cousin patted him on the back. "You must be so proud of Tyler," he said, his voice thick with nostalgia. "He's turning into a fine young man, just like his father, right?" "Right," Andrew said, nodding, but the words didn't sit well. There was something in the way people often remarked on Tyler's resemblance to Luke, something he'd dismissed too many times before. Just as Andrew's mind began to wander, Helen approached, cutting through the noise. "Andrew, could you grab some more wine from the cellar?" she asked. Her smile seemed painted on, her touch light on his arm. "We're running low." "Sure thing," he replied, looking into her eyes. They darted away quickly. "Don't be long," she added with forced cheer, before slipping back into the throng. As he turned, Tyler, Jacob, and Arya suddenly materialized around him. "Hey, Dad," Tyler said, his voice strained. "Need any help?" "Yeah," Jacob chimed in. "We could come along." Andrew studied their faces. The smiles were there, but something was missing, warmth, sincerity, or both. "It's fine. I've got it." He moved toward the basement door, his children's eyes tracking him until he disappeared. Andrew hesitated at the top of the basement stairs, his hand on the old brass doorknob. The sounds of the family reunion buzzed faintly behind him, clinking glasses, distant laughter. But down below, he heard something else, something quieter and more intimate. His heart hammered in his chest as he pushed the door open, the hinges creaking loudly in the silence. The moment the door closed behind him, the muffled sounds of the party grew distant. Andrew walked down the stairs, his footsteps echoing. Dust motes danced in the dim light, filtering through a narrow window. The basement was dimly lit, a single bulb casting weak light over scattered boxes and old furniture. He descended slowly, each step heavy. Halfway down, the muffled voices became clearer, Helen's familiar laugh, followed by a deeper voice. "Luke." The words were indistinct, but their tone was unmistakable, intimate, teasing, and far too close. Andrew's foot touched the concrete floor. He stopped, his pulse pounding in his ears. The sight before him made him freeze. Helen stood in Luke's arms, their bodies pressed together. They turned to the sound of his breath catching, a sharp, involuntary gasp. Helen's eyes met his. There was no shock or guilt, only a twisted smile that made his blood run cold. Halfway down, voices reached his ears, quiet, urgent tones that made his heart pound. He recognized Helen's voice first, sharp and teasing, followed by Luke's, smooth and confident. Andrew stopped, one hand gripping the banister. He wanted to turn back, but a darker impulse kept him rooted in place. "You're too bold, Luke," Helen said, her words edged with amusement. "Come on," Luke replied. "It's almost thrilling, isn't it? You love this, admit it." Helen laughed, a sound Andrew hadn't heard from her in a long time. "We have to be careful. Andrew's not as clueless as you think, isn't he?" Luke countered, his tone mocking. 20 years, Helen, and he still believes everything we show him. He's a convenient provider, nothing more. Andrew's grip on the railing tightened. He felt his pulse in his temples. A surge of rage surged up, but he forced himself to breathe, to listen. He stepped down silently, reaching the last few steps just as Helen's voice turned cold. "Be quiet. He might hear us." Luke's reply was lost as Andrew stepped fully into view. Helen turned, her eyes wide for a split second before they hardened. Luke's smile faded, replaced by something that looked like annoyance more than guilt. "Well, there it is," Helen said, her voice dripping with a strange mix of relief and defiance. "No more sneaking around." Andrew struggled to find words. What? What is this?" "An end to your delusions, I suppose." She crossed her arms, glancing at Luke, who simply shrugged. Andrew's mouth was dry. "Tell me what the fuck is this?" he managed, his voice low and strained. Helen's smile widened. "Come on, Andrew. You're not that dense." Luke stepped forward, casually rolling his sleeves up. "You always did have a way of missing the obvious," he said, his voice smooth and infuriatingly calm. "Honestly, it's been a joke for years. You didn't honestly think you could keep playing this role forever, did you?" Luke added, his voice casual, as if they were discussing the weather. "Helen and I, this has been real for a long time. You were just a placeholder." Andrew's fist clenched, his knuckles turning white. "How long?" Helen tilted her head, pretending to think. "Oh, since before Tyler was born. Nearly 2 decades, give or take." The weight of her words crashed over him. "And the kids?" Luke answered before Helen could. "Mine. All of them. They've known for a long time." Andrew's knees threatened to give way. He backed up a step, bumping into a shelf. You let me think they were mine?" Helen shrugged, as if discussing a trivial matter. "You were useful, Andrew. A good provider. That's all." Rage boiled in him. "I loved you. I love them. How could you spare me?" Helen snapped, her voice suddenly hard. "You loved the image of us, the perfect little family. But you never really looked, did you?" Luke chuckled. "Face it, big brother. You were a convenient stand-in. Nothing more." At that moment, footsteps echoed from the staircase. Andrew turned to see Tyler, Jacob, and Arya standing there, their expressions cold and detached. For a brief, desperate moment, he hoped they were unaware of the betrayal. He reached out to them. "Kids, listen to me," he said, his voice breaking. "Whatever you've been told." Tyler cut him off, stepping forward with a sneer. "Stop embarrassing yourself." "We know." Andrew felt like the floor had dropped out from under him. "What do you mean, you know?" Jacob, the middle child, crossed his arms. "We've always known. Uncle Luke is our real dad. You're just the guy who paid for everything. We don't want you anymore." Arya's gaze was icy. "You never meant anything to us." The words pierced him deeper than any betrayal from Helen or Luke. Andrew staggered back, struggling to comprehend. "I raised you," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I loved you. Did you really think that was enough?" Tyler said, his tone dripping with disdain. "You were a tool, Andrew. We don't need you anymore." Silence fell over the room. Andrew's breath came in ragged gasps. He turned his gaze back to Helen and Luke. "You've poisoned everything." Helen rolled her eyes. "Don't be dramatic. You were blind. You still are." Luke smirked. "We're done here, Andrew. You can leave." A wave of fury coursed through Andrew. He took a step forward, his eyes locked on his brother. "You think this is over? You think I'll just disappear?" Luke met his glare without flinching. "What can you do? We've already won." Andrew's fists tightened. He wanted to lash out, to wipe the smug look off Luke's face, but he knew that would be playing into their hands. He forced himself to turn away, his legs heavy as lead. As he reached the stairs, Helen spoke again, her voice taunting. "Leaving already? I thought you'd at least fight for your pride." He paused but didn't look back. "I'll see you all burn for this," he said quietly, each word laced with cold resolve. Climbing the steps felt like wading through quicksand. At the top, he stopped and looked back. The sight of them, his wife, his brother, his children, all united against him, burned itself into his memory. He closed the door without another word and walked back through the party, his movements mechanical. The noise of the celebration was deafening, but he heard nothing. In the distance, a relative called out, raising a glass in his direction. Andrew nodded stiffly, his mind already racing with plans. This betrayal would not go unanswered. He had been a pawn in their game for too long. Now it was time to act. Andrew's vision blurred by tears and rage. The noise of the party assaulted his ears, but he barely registered it. Conversations, laughter, music, it all became an indistinct roar. He pushed past relatives who tried to stop him, brushing off concerned hands and ignoring confused looks. His breath came in short, harsh gasps as he walked out of the house and into the cold night air. He leaned against his car, the metal cool under his hands. Everything he'd known, everything he believed about his life, was a lie. Images flashed through his mind, Helen's smile on their wedding day, holding Tyler for the first time, family vacations where he'd felt complete. All of it twisted and tainted now. Andrew gritted his teeth until his jaw ached, feeling the weight of betrayal suffocating him. "Andrew," a distant voice broke through his haze. It was his cousin, Wesley, approaching cautiously. "You okay? What happened?" Andrew didn't answer. He climbed into his car, slammed the door shut, and drove away, the tires screeching on the pavement. The world outside blurred past as he sped down empty streets. He didn't know where he was going. He just needed to move to escape. That night, sleep never came. He sat in his dark living room, staring at old photo albums spread out before him. Each page felt like a knife to his chest. Helen's smiling face, the kids' birthday parties, Luke standing beside him at countless family gatherings. His hands trembled as he traced over Tyler's baby photo. How many times had he looked at these pictures, proud and happy, never knowing the truth? The next morning, Andrew knew what he had to do. There would be no second chances, no discussions, no forgiveness. His love had been manipulated, used against him. He played the fool for too long. 2 days later, Andrew sat across from his lawyer, Robert Simmons. The office was sterile, with framed degrees lining the walls and a faint smell of coffee lingering in the air. "I need everything done quickly," Andrew said, his voice flat but determined. Robert adjusted his glasses, sensing the weight behind Andrew's words. "Understood. Divorce papers first?" "Yes, and I want to revise my will." Andrew's eyes were cold, devoid of the warmth that had once defined him. "They're all out of it. Helen, Luke, and the children. I don't want them to get a single cent." Robert hesitated. "Andrew, are you sure?" "I'm sure," Andrew interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. "Make it happen." As Robert took notes, Andrew's mind drifted. Helen and Luke's betrayal burned like acid, but the children's rejection cut deeper. He'd been their father in every way that mattered, and they'd turned on him without hesitation. The pain morphed into a cold resolve. They would feel the consequences of their choices. Within days, Helen was served with divorce papers. Andrew made sure she received them while she was still at the house they'd shared, a house he now despised. Helen's reaction was immediate. She called him repeatedly, leaving frantic voicemails. Andrew listened to one before deleting the rest. "Andrew, please. I know you're hurt, but we need to talk. It wasn't supposed to come out this way. The kids need us to figure this out." He deleted the message, his finger trembling slightly. He couldn't afford to let her words weaken him. When Helen showed up at his office unannounced, security had to escort her out. She screamed his name as they dragged her away, her voice echoing down the corridor. Colleagues whispered, but Andrew kept his head down, focusing on the mountain of paperwork on his desk. He refused to let her see him falter. Luke was next. Years ago, Andrew had gifted his younger brother a substantial stake in the family business, a gesture of trust and love. Now, that trust was gone, replaced by a burning need for retribution. Andrew called an emergency board meeting. By the end of it, Luke's shares had been liquidated, leaving him financially ruined. News of Luke's sudden downfall spread quickly. Andrew imagined his brother's face when he realized what had happened. Shock, disbelief, humiliation. It wasn't enough to ease the pain, but it was a start. A week later, the children came. Andrew was in his new apartment, a modest place far from the house he'd once called home. He heard the knock at the door and knew it would be them. Part of him wanted to ignore it, to let them stand outside forever. But he opened the door, his expression blank. "Tyler, Jacob, and Arya stood there, their faces a mix of uncertainty and defiance. Tyler stepped forward, tried to sound confident. "We need to talk." Andrew didn't move. "About what?" "Mom says you're being unreasonable," Jacob added. "We need to work this out." Andrew's eyes narrowed. "Work what out?" "You made your choice." Arya spoke up, her voice softer than the others. "We're still your kids." "No," Andrew said quietly but firmly. "You were never mine." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Tyler's jaw clenched. "Fine. Be that way." They turned and left, and Andrew closed the door. He leaned against it, the weight of everything pressing down on him. He wanted to feel relief, vindication, something, but all he felt was hollow. The next few months were a blur of paperwork, meetings, and silence. Andrew sold the house, cutting away the last ties to his former life. Friends and family reached out, but he kept his distance. He needed time to rebuild, to find himself again. In the quiet moments, when the weight of betrayal threatened to crush him, he reminded himself that he'd survived. He'd been used, broken, but he'd survived. And now it was time to start over. The years after Andrew walked out on his former life were a crucible. He left behind the hollow echoes of betrayal and built himself anew. The process wasn't linear. Some days felt impossible, the weight of everything he'd lost pressing down on him until he could barely move. But each morning, he forced himself to rise. Therapy sessions became a lifeline. Dr. Hayward, a no-nonsense therapist with sharp eyes and a quiet demeanor, cut through his defenses. "You were used, Andrew," she said bluntly during one session. "But that doesn't define who you are. It defines them." He didn't want to believe it at first, but slowly he did. He poured his energy into work, expanding his business, using the anger and pain to fuel his ambition. The hours were long and grueling, but the results were undeniable. The business thrived, earning Andrew a reputation as a shrewd, relentless leader. But it wasn't all about work. He took up boxing, channeling his rage into each jab and hook. He traveled, seeing places he'd only dreamed of. He learned to be alone, to find peace within himself. And then, when he least expected it, love found him again. Her name was Laura, a witty, compassionate woman he met at a charity gala. Their connection was slow, tentative. Andrew was wary, scarred by his past, but Laura was patient. One night, as they walked along a quiet beach, she slipped her hand into his. "You don't have to carry it all alone," she whispered. In that moment, Andrew realized he was ready to let go, just a little. 5 years passed in this way, steady, healing progress. Then one cold evening, there was a knock at the door. Andrew paused, mid-sip of his coffee. Visitors were rare. He carefully curated his circle. He opened the door, and there they were, Tyler, Jacob, and Arya. The sight of them sent a rush of emotions through him, anger, sadness, confusion, but he kept his face impassive. The three of them looked different than he remembered. Older, worn down. Tyler's once proud posture was slouched, his clothes wrinkled. Jacob fidgeted, unable to meet Andrew's eyes. Arya stood at the back, her arms wrapped around herself. "Dad," Tyler began, his voice rough. "We need to talk." Andrew crossed his arms. "I'm not your father," he said evenly, the words laced with finality. "What do you want?" Tyler's jaw clenched, but he pushed on. We've fallen on hard times?" "No kidding," Andrew replied, his gaze cold. "Get to the point." Jacob stepped forward. "Mom and Luke, it's bad. They're broke. Everything fell apart." Andrew raised an eyebrow. "And?" Arya finally spoke, her voice trembling. "We need help. College funds, we can't." Andrew's laugh was harsh and humorless. "College? You come here after all this time, asking me for money?" Tyler's eyes flashed. "You have an obligation," he spat. "You raised us. You can't just." "Obligation?" Andrew's voice was dangerously quiet. He stepped closer, forcing them back. "Let me make one thing clear. I don't owe you anything. Not a single thing." Jacob shifted uneasily. "Look, we were wrong. We know that now. But we're family." "Family?" Andrew's tone was incredulous. "Is that what you call what you did? Turning your back on me?" telling me I was nothing more than a wallet. Arya wiped away tears. Please, we were just kids. We didn't understand. Andrew's eyes softened for a moment, but then he remembered the cold looks, the harsh words. I beg you to listen. You chose your side. Tyler's desperation turned to anger. So what? You're just going to watch us suffer? Be the petty, vindictive man Mom said you were? Andrew's face hardened. I'm not your scapegoat anymore. You made your choices. He stepped back and reached for the door. Goodbye. Wait, Arya cried, stepping forward. Please, just don't shut us out like this. We have nothing. Andrew paused, his hand on the doorframe. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, without another word, he closed the door. The sound of it shutting echoed in the hallway. He leaned against it, heart pounding, breath ragged. He'd thought he would feel triumphant. He'd fantasized about this moment, about turning them away, about making them feel even a fraction of the pain they'd caused. But now that it was real, he only felt empty. Minutes passed. He heard them talking outside, muffled and frantic, but eventually they left. Andrew stood there in the silence, trying to catch his breath. He had won, hadn't he? He'd built a life without them, a better one. He wasn't their fool anymore. But as he walked back into the living room, where Laura waited with concern in her eyes, he realized that victory didn't feel like he'd imagined. It was messy, complicated, and far from the clean break he'd once envisioned. She came to him, wrapping her arms around him. Are you okay? She asked softly. Andrew closed his eyes and held her tightly. I don't know, he admitted. He was free of his past, but it would always be a part of him, a scar, a reminder. He'd rebuilt himself from the ashes of betrayal, but healing wasn't linear. Revenge had been served, but at what cost? Andrew didn't have all the answers. He only knew one thing. He was moving forward one step at a time. Andrew wasn't surprised when Helen showed up at his doorstep. In some twisted way, he'd been expecting it. Word had likely spread from his encounter with the kids, and desperation drove her to find him. When he opened the door, she stood there, looking like a ghost of the woman he once knew. Her eyes were red and swollen, her clothes wrinkled and worn. The confident, dazzling Helen who once commanded attention at every party was gone. All that remained was a hollow shell. Andrew, she whispered, her voice cracking. She stepped forward, but he didn't move to let her in. Instead, he crossed his arms and leaned against the doorframe, his expression unreadable. What do you want? He asked coldly. Her shoulders slumped. I need to talk. Talk. He let out a bitter laugh. Funny. You never wanted to talk before. Please. She took a shaky breath, and then, to his astonishment, fell to her knees. Tears streamed down her face. I was wrong, Andrew. We were all wrong. The sight of her kneeling, broken and pleading, stirred a mix of emotions within him. Anger, disgust, and an ache that he quickly pushed away. He wouldn't let her see him weak. Helen's hands trembled as she reached out toward him. I have nothing left, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The business is gone. Luke, he's a mess. The kids, they're suffering. I can't fix it alone. Andrew's jaw clenched. And what do you expect me to do about it? She looked up at him, hope flickering in her eyes. Help us. Please. You're the only one who can. He stared at her for a long moment, his mind reeling. Once, he would have done anything for her. He'd built a life around her, trusted her, loved her. But that was before he found her in Luke's arms, before the children he'd raised turned their backs on him. Those memories burned in his chest like acid. Do you remember that night? He asked, his voice low and dangerous. The night I found out? The way you smirked at me? Helen flinched. I was cruel. I know that. I was trying to hurt you because I was hurting. Andrew's laugh was cold. Hurting? You think that justifies what you did? No, she admitted, tears spilling faster now. Nothing can justify it. I was selfish, and I destroyed everything we had. I see that now. He stepped closer, his gaze piercing. Did you see it when you were lying to me every day? When you were making me believe I was their father? When you made me a fool? Helen sobbed, her hands covering her face. I regret it every day. I was stupid, blind. I thought I could have it all. You did, Andrew said icily. For a while. But it wasn't enough. Was it? No, she choked out. It was never enough. Silence hung between them. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves around them. Andrew wanted to walk away, to leave her there, but he couldn't. He needed to hear her say it everything. How long? He asked, his voice flat. What? She whispered, confused. How long were you with him? He couldn't keep the bitterness from his tone. Helen closed her eyes, the weight of her shame pressing down on her. From the beginning, she said softly. Even before we were married. Andrew's world tilted. He took a step back, struggling to breathe. Before? The word was like a knife. It was a mistake, she insisted, desperation creeping into her voice. One that spiraled out of control. I tried to end it, but I was weak. He shook his head, his hands balling into fists. You robbed me of my life. You let me believe in a lie. I know. She crawled forward, grasping at his pant leg. I know, and I hate myself for it. Andrew pulled away, repulsed. Don't touch me. Helen withdrew, her shoulders shaking. I'm begging you, Andrew. I don't expect forgiveness. I need you to understand. For the children's sake, if nothing else. He felt a flash of anger. The children? You mean the ones who told me I was just a provider? The ones who chose him over me? They were confused. Manipulated, she said, trying to defend them. They didn't know what they were doing. They knew enough, Andrew said coldly. And so did you. He turned away, unable to look at her any longer. I built my life again, Helen. I worked hard to get past what you did to me. And now you come here, expecting what? A handout? A second chance? Not for me, she pleaded. For them. They're still your children. No, Andrew said firmly, turning back to her. They're not. Helen's face crumpled. I understand. I deserve this. But please don't punish them for my sins. You punish them yourself, he shot back. When you dragged them into this mess. When you used them as pawns. She bowed her head, defeated. I thought I could make it right. But I can't. Not without you. There's no making it right, Andrew said quietly. There's only moving on. He took a step back into the house, his expression hardening. You made your choice, Helen. You all did. Please, she whispered one last time, her voice breaking. I'm sorry. No, Andrew said, his voice steady and final. You're sorry because you lost. That's not the same as regret. With that, he closed the door. The sound of it shutting was like the end of a chapter, a finality that left no room for doubt. He stood there for a long time, listening to her sobs on the other side. Slowly, they faded, and then there was silence. Andrew walked to the kitchen, poured himself a glass of water, and stared out the window. The past was behind him now. He'd faced it, and he'd won. But victory, he realized, wasn't sweet. It was bitter and cold. Still, it was his, and that had to be enough. The days after Andrew shut the door on Helen felt like the final purge of a poison that had long lingered. For years, his heart had been chained to the betrayal of the past. Now, with each passing day, he focused on moving forward. Healing wasn't a linear journey. It was messy, filled with moments of doubt and setbacks. But Andrew was determined. He poured himself into his work, expanding his company further and mentoring young entrepreneurs. Outside of work, he took up hiking, a newfound passion that brought him peace and a sense of accomplishment. And it was on one of those hikes that he met someone who would change his life in ways he hadn't dared to hope. The morning was crisp, the scent of pine hanging in the air. Andrew had just reached the summit of a trail when he noticed her. She stood at the edge of a rocky outcrop, gazing out at the rolling hills below. Wind swept through her auburn hair, and there was a serene intensity in her eyes that caught Andrew's attention. He almost turned away, not wanting to intrude, but at that moment, she turned and smiled. Beautiful, isn't it? She said, her voice warm and genuine. Yeah, Andrew replied, taking a few cautious steps closer. It never gets old. She extended her hand. I'm Jasmine. Andrew, he said, shaking her hand. Do you come here often? Jasmine chuckled. Is it your way of asking if I'm a hiker, or if you've just never seen me here before? Caught off guard, Andrew laughed, a real, deep laugh that felt unfamiliar but welcome. I guess a bit of both. They talked for hours, sitting on the rocks as the sun climbed higher. Andrew found himself sharing pieces of his story, carefully at first, but more freely as the conversation went on. Jasmine listened without judgment, offering insights when he paused and silence when he needed it. When they eventually descended the trail together, he realized he didn't feel the usual weight of regret or the gnawing pain of old wounds. He felt lighter. Their relationship blossomed over the following months. Jasmine was kind and intelligent, with a dry sense of humor that often caught Andrew by surprise. She wasn't afraid to call him out when he brooded too much or pulled away. "You can't outrun your past forever," she said one night over dinner. "But you don't have to let it define you either." Trust was the hardest part. There were moments when Andrew's fears surfaced. What if it all crumbled again? What if she betrayed him too? He told Jasmine this, expecting her to recoil, but she took his hand instead. "I'm not her," she said gently. "And you're not the man you were then. We'll figure this out together." So they did. Therapy sessions continued, this time with Jasmine by his side. They learned to navigate their differences, to communicate openly. When Andrew proposed a year later, it wasn't with grand gestures or flashy declarations. It was quiet, heartfelt, and filled with a raw sincerity that left both of them in tears. One sunny afternoon, as Andrew worked in his study, he noticed an envelope slipped under his door. He picked it up, noting the familiar handwriting. It was from Tyler. His hands trembled as he opened it. The letter was long, filled with apologies and reflections. Tyler admitted his mistakes, the blind loyalty to his mother and Luke, the hurtful words he'd spoken, and the years lost because of pride. He described the hardships they'd faced, poverty, broken dreams, and regret that gnawed at him every day. Tyler didn't ask for money. He didn't ask for anything except a chance to talk. Andrew read the letter 3 times before setting it down. Anger surged first. Where was this remorse when he needed it most? When he begged them to see reason? But beneath the anger was a flicker of something else, hope. Was it possible that Tyler truly understood the damage he'd done? Jasmine found him sitting on the porch, staring at the horizon. "You okay?" she asked, sitting beside him. He handed her the letter. She read it silently, then placed it down. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know," he admitted. "I want to hate him. I thought I'd never give him another chance." "Do you still feel that way?" Andrew was quiet for a long time. "No," he whispered, "but I don't know if I can forgive." "Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting," Jasmine said softly, "or excusing what he did. It means deciding how much space you want the past to take up in your life." They sat together in the quiet, Jasmine's hand resting on his. Andrew thought back to the years he'd spent feeling like a stranger in his own family. The betrayal was a wound, but wounds could heal, slowly, painfully, but they could. Did he want to give Tyler a chance to prove himself? Or would it be opening himself up to more pain? Days passed before Andrew responded. He met Tyler at a small cafe, their first face-to-face meeting in 5 years. Tyler looked older, the lines on his face speaking of hardships and regrets. They sat in awkward silence, the air thick with unspoken words. "I meant everything I wrote," Tyler said finally, his voice raw. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I don't even know why you're here." Andrew leaned back, studying his son. "I'm here because I needed to know if you really meant it. I needed to see you." "I did," Tyler said quickly. "I do." Andrew nodded slowly. "You hurt me. All of you did. I trusted you. And you threw it away." Tyler's eyes filled with tears. "I know. I don't expect you to forgive me. I needed to tell you that I'm sorry." For a moment, Andrew said nothing. Then he spoke quietly. "I can't promise we'll ever be what we were. Too much has happened. I understand, but I'm willing to try. On my terms." Slowly, relief washed over Tyler's face. "Thank you." The path to reconciliation was long and filled with challenges. But for the first time, Andrew felt that it was possible. With Jasmine's support, he began to rebuild bridges, not for the sake of what had been lost, but for the future he was determined to shape. Healing was a journey, and Andrew was finally ready to walk it, step by step. The years slipped by with a quiet rhythm. Andrew built a life rooted in love, resilience, and hard-won peace. He and Jasmine continued to grow together, their relationship built on mutual respect and unwavering support. The scars of betrayal still existed, but they no longer defined him. Until one day, when a ghost from the past unexpectedly knocked at his door. Andrew opened it to see a familiar face, a gaunt man with sunken eyes and hair streaked with gray. It was Luke. Tom had not been kind to him. He was thinner, his confident swagger long gone, replaced by a haggard expression. Andrew felt a rush of emotions, anger, disgust, and a trace of pity. For a moment, he considered slamming the door. But he didn't. He needed to hear what this ghost had to say. "What do you want?" Andrew asked, his voice cold. Luke glanced around nervously, as if afraid someone might be watching. "I need to talk to you." There's nothing left to say. Andrew's grip tightened on the doorknob. "Please." Luke's voice cracked. "It's about Helen and everything that happened." Against his better judgment, Andrew stepped aside and let him in. They walked to the living room, the tension thick in the air. Andrew gestured for Luke to sit, but he remained standing, as if the weight of his own sins wouldn't allow him to rest. "Say what you need to say," Andrew prompted, keeping a safe distance. Luke ran a trembling hand through his hair. "You were right to hate me, to cut me out. I deserved everything. But there's something you don't know, something I need to tell you." "Get to the point," Andrew demanded. Luke took a shaky breath. "I lied to her. To Helen." Andrew's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" "From the beginning," Luke confessed. "I manipulated her, made her believe things about you that weren't true. I painted you as someone cold, unfeeling. I told her you were having affairs, that you didn't love her, that you saw her as just a trophy." A cold silence settled over the room. Andrew felt as if the ground beneath him was shifting. "Why?" he whispered, his voice dangerously low. Luke swallowed hard. "Because I wanted her. I was jealous of you, always have been. You were the older brother, the successful one. Everyone loved you. I wanted what you had. And I twisted everything to make her doubt you." Andrew clenched his fists, his body trembling with rage. "So you poisoned her against me, against our entire life together." Luke nodded, shame written all over his face. "I know it doesn't change what she did. She chose to believe me. She chose to betray you. But I made it easier for her. I made her doubt you every step of the way." Andrew stared at him, his mind racing. The betrayal had been deep enough without this added layer of deceit. He wanted to punch Luke, to make him feel even a fraction of the pain he'd caused. But he stood frozen, torn between fury and exhaustion. "And you think telling me this now will fix anything?" Andrew asked bitterly. "No," Luke said quickly. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even expect you to care. But I've lost everything, and I needed you to know that it was all my fault." Andrew shook his head slowly. "It doesn't change what she did. It doesn't make her innocent." "I know," Luke agreed, his shoulders slumping. I couldn't carry it alone anymore." Andrew turned away, the weight of it all pressing down on him. "Get out." Luke hesitated. "Andrew, get out." Andrew roared, his voice echoing through the room. He didn't turn back until he heard the door close behind Luke. Alone, he collapsed onto the couch, his mind a storm of memories and emotions. That evening, Andrew sat with Jasmine, his hands clasped tightly together. He'd recounted the entire conversation, his voice steady but his eyes betraying the turmoil within. "What are you feeling?" Jasmine asked gently. "I don't know," he admitted. "Anger, sadness, exhaustion. It doesn't change what happened. It doesn't make it better." "No," she agreed, placing her hand over his. "But maybe it can help you make peace with some of it." Andrew met her eyes. "How? How do you make peace with years of lies and betrayal?" "By deciding how much more of your life you're willing to let it consume," Jasmine said softly. "Luke and Helen are trapped in their own misery. You're not." He was silent for a long time. The truth was he didn't want revenge anymore. He'd taken his pound of flesh. Luke and Helen were paying for their choices every day. But closure? That was harder to define. "Maybe closure isn't about forgiving them," Jasmine continued. "Maybe it's about forgiving yourself for trusting them, for being hurt." Andrew nodded slowly. "Maybe." The next day, Andrew went for a long walk. He thought about his past, his family, and the life he'd rebuilt. He thought about Luke's confession and Helen's choices. In the end, He realized that closure didn't have to be some grand gesture or a moment of reconciliation. It was a decision to let the past remain in the past. Months later, Andrew stood by a serene lake with Jasmine by his side. They were attending a charity event he'd helped organize, something he'd thrown himself into to give back. The sun dipped low, casting a warm glow over the water. Jasmine squeezed his hand. "You okay?" she asked. "I think so," he replied. For the first time in a long time, she smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Good." Helen and Luke's suffering continued, each trapped in their own cycles of regret and bitterness. It was their burden to bear. Andrew's burden had been different, to rise above, to rebuild, to find happiness again. And he had. The past was a scar, a reminder of pain, but also of survival. It didn't define him. Not anymore. Andrew chose peace, not for them, but for himself. As he looked out at the water, he felt truly free.